And finally Legions. Despite being one of the most charismatic factions and my personal favorite, they actually have quite a lot of problems. At higher tiers, most of the units are inferior stat-wise to the opponents. All the supports in battle matches are in the same branch, so you can have only one. And last but not least, the abundance of 2-slot units limits their party composition options. And yet they are far from weak. In a profane effort to overcome those weaknesses, they utilize tactics that lie beyond the reach of mere mortals. Or at least tactics that others have no need for. We'll get to those in due time, but for now let's start with the Lords. Sadly, no surprise here, Warrior is your choice. The Legion's Gargoyle can mitigate a lot of damage and significantly simplify the party HP management. Besides, Doppelganger can heal you up from time to time. But all those tricks are mostly for early stage of the game, and even then, at the end of the day, there is no escape from the fact that Legions will get hurt. And you will need a way to heal that damage, and regeneration is the best one. Just ask your Infernal Knights if you don't believe me. Duke's stats are identical to Pegasus Knight, but he's much better looking one, and that's actually his biggest weakness. One of the main features of Legions is wings. All the heroes except Sif can fly. So this ability isn't a selling point for the warrior hero anymore. The next crucial thing to consider is his physical damage, as it comes as double-edged sword. On one hand, all notable bosses are immune to fire, so Duke is actually a better choice for those. But on the other hand, it's not vital and your army can handle those without any help from your hero. At the same time, as I already mentioned, support units and mages are all in one branch, and supports are a much better choice. So in the case of Duke, you are actually left without elemental damage in your party, which is obviously bad, but it's not all that grim. Legions have ways to work around this hindrance. Chancellor is the most mobile secondary hero in the game, which makes him the perfect road hero hunter. Clans can make their heroes even more mobile through spells, but those are usually used on the main hero, so Chancellor is beyond competition. Also, he has a damn cool crossbow. Aside from the visual, this makes him the only true archer of the Legions. Is it useful? Well, not really, but combine him with Gargoyle and you have a guaranteed way to remove an enemy mage before they turn. Combat-wise, Archdevil is the weakest among mage heroes. He doesn't have immunity to death magic and poison, doesn't have Archdruids to buff him up, and even his damage source is the most resisted fire. But he has wings, and that redeems everything. The thing is, mobility is also sort of a battle stat. High mobility means better map control, as a result, more resources. After all, the longer enemies stay in the fog of war, the higher their level will be. Also, sometimes you may desire it. And lastly, for the reasons mentioned above, the mage fits into Legion's party composition much better than the warrior. Baroness probably can be called the truest root beer. She's mobile, her offensive potential is slightly above zero, but at the same time her fear attack allows her to survive encounters that would be fatal for other road heroes. By the way, fear works as paralyze when you attack towns and capitals. So if after all you still decide to use her as main hero, at least you will have some boon. Sif this time wears red clothes to match the faction style. Other than that, there is nothing much to say here. As the Legions lack healing options and don't have crowd control from the start, challenging enemy mage to duel or poisoning squads are both very handy ways to minimize damage taken in the early stages. As for unique artifacts, we have two blades already familiar to us, Stormbringer and Mournblade. No, wait, that's a different story. Two blades, one belonging to Thanatos and the other one of Wicked Persuasion. The Wicked blade comes too late to be of any use, while the Thanatos one actually falls into hands of our hero very early. At this stage, well, it's still not very interesting for a warrior, but for a mage it provides on average about the same damage bonus as standard attack artifact, while pushing the potential damage limit further and as always being good during town sieges. Possessed is identical to Undead Fighter, and this is good, as they have the best stat pool. They don't lose HP like Empire or Initiative like Clans. At tier 2 he becomes a Berserk, getting a standard 50 HP and 25 damage. Then comes Anti-Paladin, with another standard bonus and one of the best looks and animations in the whole game. Finally at tier 4 he turns into Infernal Knight, or rather Infernal Samurai. who in addition to normal stat growth gets a hidden boon hinted in their description. Unlike most other, he regenerates 20% HP per turn instead of 5. When combined with Warrior Lord, Knight regenerates a third of his health, which is actually useful on him and here the discussion of the unit's problems begins. So up to tier 3, Legion Warriors are actually the best, on par with Hordes 1, simply because of their superior stats, but as soon as they reach tier 4, they start to fall behind rapidly, as Empire units are already better, and soon everyone else will jump to the next tier, simply leaving Knights no chance. And it wouldn't be a big problem if only Knights weren't the only single-tile frontline choice of Legions, except for the hero itself. So returning to regeneration. Yes, it's useful. It doesn't provide direct combat bonuses, but helps with maintaining tempo overall. Besides knowing that they will restore a sort of the HP allows you to use them more recklessly. Where other warriors would prefer to use defense, Knights can go all in and not care about the damage taken. It's a small consolation, but at least it's something, as after all Infernal Knights remain the weakest warriors among all factions. Cultist is also identical stat-wise to Hordes Initiate, but in the context of Legions, he is actually much more than meets the eye, and plays a far bigger role, to which we will return in just a few minutes. On tier 2, male cultists become sorcerers, while girls turn into witches, whom Empire footmen are hunting. Sorcerer gets standard 30 HP and 15 damage. Then comes another choice. Continue as it is and becomes Demonologist with standard stat bonuses and very stylish robe, or change his nature and turn into Doppelganger. At another crossroad, walk straight and continue as Pandemonius, or choose a side path and become Incubus. Finally, at tier 5, Pandemonius evolves into Madeus, with an additional 5 HP and Fireward in addition to standard stat growth. Alternatively, Demonologist can turn into Incubus, getting 30 HP and 65% chance to petrify the enemy party for one turn. And yes, Incubus is the best crowd control unit. Not only is his chance higher than what Shade has, but the Earth element is the rarest to be resisted. As for the girls, Witch gets standard HP bonus and now instead of attacking turns a single enemy into Imp or Fat Imp, according to their size. One of the good things about Polymorph is that it can last several turns, but Witch unfortunately has an unstable version of it, which can end just before enemy turn, effectively doing nothing. At tier 3, Witch becomes Hack, getting 10 HP more than usual, and from now on her Polymorph will last at least one enemy turn. Finally, Hack becomes Succubus. Her accuracy drops from 80 to only 40, but now she tries to polymorph all enemies at once. We will discuss in a second the usefulness of it, but before that let's return to our Doppelganger. His stats actually don't really matter, as at the beginning of combat he chooses to transform into any single cell unit presented on the battlefield, except Capital Guardian. Unfortunately, only into their base form, ignoring overleveling. Is he good? Well, yes and no. Doppelganger is a unit of contrast. His usefulness varies from must-have to what the heck I'm supposed to do with you. Obviously he is as powerful as the one he is emulating. So if for example you have some very strong special unit, something like 300 HP, high initiative, paralyze on attack, in this case yes, he is incredible. But jokes aside, Doppelganger is very fun. He can copy strong neutrals like Medusa, Mermaid or Orc King, clans Alchemist or Empire Healers, although they are not very often present in the enemy parties, while every Archangel is just a free HP potion. And of course Undead Ghosts, not only bringing paralyzes against their own dragons, but also becoming immune to their attacks. By the way, the funny thing is that as he copies HP of his target, leveling up actually only makes it harder to heal him up with potions. Also, he becomes more resistant to enemy spells. But anyway, all this copying of enemy units is all well and good, but to be effective Doppelganger needs two things. The first one, backup target to copy from your own party, and actually a free space, so he can jump from frontline to backline when it's needed. And here the problem starts. As obvious as sooner or later your party will become full and he will lose his battle flexibility. And as for backups, among melee units you have anti-paladins who are great, but after this the warriors become less and less viable. And for ranged, only your hero, who at level 1 will be identical to a tier 2 unit. So while you have access to only tier 3 units, Doppelganger is great. Yeah, turning into a hero isn't ideal, but overall he compensates for it with flexibility in the long term. You fight a single enemy, turn into anti-paladin. You need AoE into a mage hero. You fight the Empire into healer, assassin or even mage. You get the idea. But after tier 3 his usefulness drops in no time and settles at almost zero when it comes to heavily overleveled units. So yeah, hurry up to play with him while he is effective, as it is worth it. Now as for the biggest joke of the mage tree, Madeus. Despite being a tier 5 unit, he is actually the least useful one, as most of the time you will prefer someone with crowd control instead. But it's not only competition that holds him back. In terms of stats, he is just inferior to hordes, leeches and vampires. Fire protection is nice to have, but mostly it comes into play against enemy Madeuses themselves. Finally, you don't actually want to stack them for some decent AoE damage, as this way you will need to take Infernal Knight, and having two mediocre mages in pair with a mediocre warrior isn't the best strategy. So most of the time you take Madeus just to enjoy his model and animation. As for Mage 3 superstars, Incubus and Succubus, I wish I could say something new here, but no, Incubus is a much better unit. A 65% chance is just beyond any competition. Succubus has 10 additional HP, but requires much more experience to level up further, so even in terms of durability, Incubus is pretty much just better. But even Succubus actually has its niche, at least in theory. If you are playing Duke or Chancellor and choose Incubus, your party will suddenly end up without any elemental damage whatsoever. So even a single werewolf is enough to create a lot of problems. And it's lucky if you met him under open sky, as legions have a lot of great damage spells. But what to do if he sits in ruins or town? And here comes Succubus with Polymorph, as it removes all natural immunities the same as armor. In the case of Archdevil, it's not a big deal, as you will at most get the opportunity to attack otherwise immune Green Dragon, but for Warrior it's sort of a game changing, and allows you to take two big demons into your party. By the way, Polymorph doesn't remove temporary buffs, feats and items that are equipped on the enemy. So it sounds like Succubus is actually useful. Not quite. The thing is, she still has only 40% chance to hit, and that is really low. Besides, Polymorph doesn't work on Capital Guardians. And finally, it is a mind-based effect, which a lot of enemies know how to resist or ignore altogether. So there are so many disadvantages that you start to think that weapon immune enemies aren't that big of a problem after all. So what to do, how to have Incubus and deal with the weapon immunes at the same time? The obvious answer is to play Archdevil. Another less obvious answer is a locked cultist. Any faction can lock their low tier units, but apart from legions, no one actually needs it. So the locked cultist. Compared to normal high tier mages, he will always have less damage, but surprisingly, he will very quickly outrun them in terms of HP. By the time you would get Madeus, the cultist will have about 40-50 additional HP and 15-20 damage less, which actually doesn't sound like a bad deal. Another big bonus of our little friend is that he levels up in pretty much every second battle. As such, he constantly heals to full HP, and you don't need to bother about his well-being whatsoever, which is the opposite of the normal experience with mages. One thing to note here is that he can accumulate only 75 experience, which means he levels up much faster than normal units in the beginning and middle game, but in the late game a lot of experience get wasted on him, allowing other units to catch up. Don't get me wrong, he will still be massively overleveled, but most likely he will not reach the 99 level cap, despite the fact that it requires not that much of experience. Anyway, you take Incubus, Locked Cultist and Infernal Knight, and on average get a much better result than Succubus would provide. Yes, Cultist and Knight are not optimal units, but Incubus more than compensates for their weaknesses. Besides, having Cultist in addition to your ranged hero or gargoyle actually provides quite a good defense for Incubus against enemy mages, significantly reducing the damage he takes. And yes, keeping your crowd control unit alive is your main goal and quite a headache. Ah yes, almost forgot. Quite a big bonus of Witch Branch is that you get crowd control starting from tier 2 and don't need to wait for tier 4. This is actually quite useful in stages when your hero is not strong enough to drag the party through difficult battles yet. Gargoyle is an interesting and rather strong unit, but quite a bad archer. Anyway, the base form has 90 HP, 40 armor, 40 damage and 60 initiative. which means that her effective HP without any further armor increases is only 150, which isn't much more than what Possessed has. At tier 2 it turns into Marble Gargoyle, getting an additional 60 HP, 20 armor and 25 damage. And here the jump in durability is just huge, as now effective HP equals to 375. It is 2.5 times more than a normal Garg has. Finally, at tier 3 she becomes the Onyx one, gaining an additional 20 HP, 5 armor and 20 damage. Here the growth isn't that significant. Effective HP reaches 485, which is more but not as much of a jump as previous one. So now let's discuss them. Gargs are a hybrid unit in their nature, a tank with a bit of archery, and that's precisely how you should use them. Don't treat them as pure archers, because as such they are simply terrible in comparison to assassins. But as far as their tanking goes, they are great. In general, gargoyles are the units that guarantees a very easy early game for the legions, but unfortunately they scale quite badly into the late game and eventually lose their effectiveness. But let's go in order. The base Garg isn't very durable, but she has a huge advantage of high initiative, so she always can use defense before enemies have a chance to attack her, and that's pretty much her main role, just stand and tank. To capitalize on it, it's better to play as a ranged hero, so you can take a cultist and leave all incoming damage to the gargoyle itself. Marble 1 on the other hand is already tanky enough to actually fight and simply doesn't care about damage taken. And as an archer she obviously can attack any target, so one of the base strategies is to first focus down the enemy in front of your other frontliner. This way you not only effectively remove the threat sooner, but also a bigger chunk of the damage taken will be mitigated by the armor. Onyx Garg is also good, though not that impressive, apart from her look of course. But as the game proceeds, gargoyles become less and less useful. They require a lot of experience to level up further, and even the fact that with giants units experience is split among fewer units doesn't help much. Besides, the damage growth itself is very low. By the way, unlike most other armored characters, Garg actually improves her armor by 1 on overleveling, up to level 10. Not very useful to be honest, as it's already very easy to buff her up to reach 90 armor, and yes, an armored banner synergizes very well with all Gargs, significantly buffing the already huge effective HP. But that's not even the main problem, which is, in the late game you will have all party slots occupied, so instead of attacking the Garg, enemies will simply strike someone else. As such, Garg can't perform her tanking role any longer. It's not that bad, as you still can put a hero with a lot of armor in the corner and Garg in the center. As such, at least one enemy frontliner will be forced to attack armored units. At the same time, your center is impossible to focus down in one turn, but still it's not the same as what Garg brings to a low leadership party. So in the late game, while far less effective, they still can be useful as a way of protecting your incubus from enemy mages. Though they can't do it alone and will need help from a cultist or a hero. The last thing to mention is that in Rise of the Elves, Gargs attack with Earth, which obviously was made to help against weapon immune units. Finally, we have the support unit branch, starting with Devil, 170 HP, 50 damage and 35 initiative. At tier 2 he turns into Demon, getting the standard for this branch 100 HP and 30 damage, which already makes him quite durable. Then comes Moloch with another standard stat boost. After that there is a choice between continuing as it is or turning into AoE mages. So let's start with mages. At tier 4 Moloch turns into Beast. He gets only 50 additional HP, his damage drops to 70 and initiative to 20, but from now on he attacks all targets. Finally Beast transforms into Tiamat. 75 additional HP, 30 damage and the ability to lower the enemy damage stat by a third. On the normal pass Moloch becomes Demon Lord, a very grotesque and visually impressive unit that on top of standard stat growth also adds 5 to his initiative. The latter may seem like a small sin, but in fact 40 initiative makes demons much better against most Mountain Clans units as well as undead and neutral dragons. Then there is another choice between Overlord and Abyssal Devil. Overlord simply adds another standard stat bonus, not very interesting and yet effective. On the other hand, Abyssal Devil gets 130 HP, his damage stays the same at 140, but in return he has a 40% chance to petrify his target. Also, his color scheme is identical to Archdevil, which gives away a family connection. So demons, all three starting forms, Devil, Demon and Moloch. aren't that useful. They are okay, but most of the time you will find yourself using warriors and gargs instead. But things change on high tiers, as not only do demons themselves become better, but all other branches stop evolving after tier 3 or 4. The big advantage of huge demons is actually the HP pool, which makes them very resilient to enemy AoE attacks. They regenerate a huge amount of HP in raw numbers, and in general their main strategy is not to out-DPS the enemy, but rather to outlive them. What I mean is that party of 1 cell units has better damage numbers overall, but it's very hard to focus down giant demons in one turn. At the same time, the opponent will find that 1, 2, maybe even 3 of his small units are already dead, so his bigger initial DPS is already hindered, while demons still perform at their maximum. One of the rather fair criticism of demons is that clans giants are simply better units, despite being 1 tier lower. And it's quite true if we look at them separately from the rest of the army. Demon Lords and Beasts have simply no chance against Sons of Ymir and Elder Ones. Well, when it comes to Sons of Ymir, even tier 5 Overlords and Abyssal Devils are not straight up winners. And yet, demons have edge in terms of HP. And when you start adding control into this calculation, suddenly clans don't look that good any longer. But yes, in terms of offense, Son of Ymir is simply better. Well, at least he's better than Overlord, if you catch my meaning. As for the giant mages, Beast isn't very impressive, but Tiamat is technically the best in his class, not only having the highest damage but also a useful debuff. And yet they are probably one of the worst units in your army. Mostly it all comes down to 20 initiative and actually quite low damage. As you remember, Wyvern is great unit because her damage for a level 1 is impressive, and 35 initiative is enough to act before a lot of nasty units that could prevent your turn. Here things are the opposite. Tiamat has a very real chance not to act at all due to enemy control, then he's the least tanky giant in your army, which is actually also quite crucial. And finally, it all comes down to the fact that he doesn't bring anything valuable to the table. He can focus down dangerous enemies, his debuff, while not bad, still can compare to the petrification of Incubus, and even a Hermes initiative penalty is most of the time simply better. So you can take Tiamat if you want, and it will be okay, but it's the rest of the army that will do the heavy lifting. Now for Overlord and Abyssal Devil. Most of the time the additional 30 damage of Overlord is simply better. Petrification is useful, but if we compare Abyssal to a Phantom, he has slightly more damage, but the chance to apply the effect is 10% less. And of course, if we already have an Incubus, the usefulness of this effect is diminished. But on the other hand, they can serve as backup for your crowd controller. Or you can even combine Abyssal Devil with Succubus or Modeus. Also, such party will not be able to take Capital Guardian down, at least reliable. So at the end of the day, it's more of a matter of taste. Both will do the job done, but I personally prefer Overlords. And it's time to talk about our special unit, which this time is actually useful. Legion's Fiend is identical stat-wise to Titan, with the addition of a 40% chance to apply poison damage. And this little thing makes all the difference in the world. So, 250 HP, 60 damage, 50 initiative, and only 475 experience to level up further. Which means Fiend has the same damage scaling as an assassin, but level up more than 2 times faster. In no time his poison damage reaches enormous numbers and melts Capital Guardians like nothing else. Also his 50 initiative gives him quite an edge in many situations compared to the giant demons. But anyway, we are all interested in one simple question: how does he compare to Overlord? And it's actually quite good. Fiend will always have less HP, his potential damage will be higher, but as the poison chance will cap at only 49%, his average damage is about the same level as Overlord's. Returning to Son of Ymir, Fiend is sort of your version of this unit. More offensive compared to other demons, yet less reliable due to the randomness of poison. And of course not that good against undead units. So Fiend is not so much a straight up better unit, but rather another side grade along with Abyssal Devil. His big advantage comes from economy, as you will need only 1000 gold to get him, compared to the 8k that you would need normally. Also with Fiend you can have both Tiamat and a single target demon. Not there is a need for it, but still. Personally I like to take both Overlord and Fiend simultaneously. This way you sort of get the advantage of high initiative, high potential burst, and at the same time the reliability of Overlord. but it's even more expensive, yes. The last thing to mention is that in Rise of the Elves, Overlord gets his personal Blistered Dot effect, in addition to his normal attack, and his initiative grows to 50. So there Overlord is simply a much better unit, but you still can take both and stack a double dot. The Legion spellbook is similar to what the Undead have. It also includes good offensive spells presented at every tier, debuffs and summons. Also you don't have a tier 3 AoE summon. But in addition to this, Legions have several very, how to put it, specific spells that give them quite an advantage when used right: illusions, invisibility and paralyzes. So this time offensive spells are actually useful, especially at the beginning, as unlike Undead you don't have crowd control from the start, and most likely will not have it at all until tier 4 units. As for debuffs, you have a local version of Rust, Tormentor, that reduce enemy armor by 50 points, a very cheap spell that will be handy many times against enemy Gargs. Then we have Kronos, which reduces enemy initiative by 15%. Being a tier 2 spell, it is effectively just a worse version of Empire's Celerity. Besides, in the case of giant demons, it's often not enough to make a difference. And yet, sometimes the spell works wonders. Finally, Legions have several quite expensive accuracy reduction spells, and here it must be said that yes, overall buffs are much better than debuffs. They can last several battles, not just one, then enemies in towns are simply immune to debuffs. All this is true. But there is one case when debuffs, especially accuracy 1, are much better. When your enemy is enormously dangerous, for example, Demon Ultra or an ultra high level fiend with tons of poison. No matter how much you buff, you will still get paralyzed, poisoned, etc. So in such cases accuracy debuffs are much better. It's niche, but still. Now illusions. They cost 2 times less than normal summons, they cannot interact with anything, but they last several turns instead, which makes them perfect scouts. They are a much better tool than Empire's Daylight to control the map. Lastly, they can trigger scripted ambushes, and to dispel them enemies lose the same amount of movement points as for a normal battle. Sanctuary or simply invisibility for your squad. It's very situational spell, but when it comes into play you are always happy to have. Are you in enemy territory and don't want to be gunned down by spell barrages? Cast it. Did you win a difficult battle but now all your units are on low health? Cast it and simply regenerate HP for several rounds. And so on and so forth. A very nice tool to have. Paraceus or simply paralyzes that deplete enemy movement points. It's also a situationally quite useful spell, as you can simply nail dangerous enemy squads in one place. But be careful, as Empire and clans can restore movement points back. And finally summons. Unfortunately they are quite mediocre. Hellhound is simply a way to harass Garrison for 20 damage, but there is always a risk to level up them instead. Apart from that, it just cannot manage anyone stronger than a bunch of goblins, but sometimes even 20 damage is enough to make a difference. As for Beliar, he's actually the strongest tier 2 summon in terms of raw stats. Unfortunately, that's not a huge achievement. Dwarven Champion is still an impossible target for him, as are any level 1 enemy combat heroes. But on the bright side, Beliar is actually capable of bringing down Dwarven Champion himself, which makes his squad literally incapable of doing anything on the map.